Between the years 1847 and 1863, within a locked chamber on a Virginia estate, events transpired that three separate county clerks would later steadfastly refuse to document in any public record. Those few individuals who witnessed the truth would only speak of it in hushed whispers: a bearded woman held in isolation, three unmarried sisters who gave birth to 7 children, and a respected physician who characterized it all as scientific inquiry. When Union soldiers finally forced entry into that room in April of 1863, their discovery included chains anchored into the floorboards, medical instruments whose purposes defied understanding, and a journal written entirely in cipher. The officer who would decode that journal 43 years later would subsequently write in his personal notes, "I have witnessed battlefields and mass graves, but nothing disturbed me like understanding what transpired in that room." The case centered on a woman the family referred to only as the specimen, someone whose very existence challenged every prevailing assumption about human biology, and whose captivity served purposes that no court of that era possessed the legal language to prosecute. 17 miles from Charlottesville, buried within fragmentary records and testimonies taken decades after the fact, lies a story so disturbing that 2 entire generations attempted to erase it from historical memory. Before we continue with the account of what truly transpired in the Eastern Wing, and why a bearded enslaved woman became central to one family's darkest secret, please subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and activate the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into America's most disturbing historical mysteries. And kindly comment below telling us what state or city you're listening from. We genuinely appreciate knowing where our audience of truth seekers is located. The question that will haunt you for the next hour is deceptively simple: what could possibly justify keeping a human being locked away for 16 years? The spring of 1847 arrived cold and damp across the Virginia Piedmont. In Albemarle County, 17 miles southwest of Charlottesville, morning fog settled into the valleys like spilled milk, and the air carried the scent of wet earth and wood smoke rising from 1,000 chimneys. Covington Manor occupied a rise overlooking 800 acres of cultivated fields and forest. The main house, constructed of Georgian brick with white columns, spoke of old money and even older certainties. Inside, Dr. Edmund Covington stood at his study window, watching the fog gradually burn off under weak March sunlight. He was 41 years old, balding, possessed of the kind of methodical precision that made him both an excellent physician and an unsettling dinner companion. His 3 daughters moved through the house with practiced quietness. Sarah, aged 22, sat in the morning room with a Latin text open on her lap, though her eyes kept drifting toward the window. Elizabeth, 20, practiced piano scales in the parlor, the same scales over and over until the repetition became almost hypnotic. Margaret, just 17, assisted the household staff with breakfast preparations, her hands efficient but her mind clearly elsewhere. The girls had grown up without a mother. Caroline Covington had died in 1832, and Edmund had raised his daughters himself, or rather raised them according to principles he developed through careful study. He educated them beyond what was typical for Virginia girls of their class. They read philosophy, studied mathematics, learned basic anatomy from his medical texts. He told them that knowledge was power and that power was survival. What he never told them was what kind of knowledge he was actually seeking. In the quarters behind the main house, 37 enslaved people awakened to another day of labor. They knew the routines of Covington Manor intimately: when to be visible, when to disappear, when to speak, when silence was the only safe response. The doctor wasn't cruel by the standards of Virginia slaveholders, but there was something about his attention that felt worse than cruelty. He watched people the way a naturalist watches insects under glass. Silas Fletcher, the senior field hand, stood outside his cabin and studied the main house in the distance. Something was changing. He could feel it the way animals sense approaching storms. The doctor had been agitated for weeks, reading letters late into the night, making trips to Lynchburg and Richmond. Something was coming to Covington Manor, and Silas knew from long experience that when masters became excited about new acquisitions, enslaved people paid the price. He was right. That afternoon, a covered wagon arrived at the manor. The doctor himself went out to meet it, which was unusual. He normally sent an overseer to handle such matters. But today, he stood at the wagon bed speaking in low tones with the driver, then reached up to assist someone down. Myra Dalton, working in the kitchen garden, caught a glimpse of the new arrival. At first, she thought it was a young woman. The figure wore a simple dress and moved with a certain delicacy. But then the person turned, and Myra saw something that made her drop the basket of herbs she was carrying, a beard. Not thick stubble or a few stray hairs, but an actual beard, dark, visible, growing across a face that otherwise appeared entirely feminine. The doctor led the newcomer directly into the house through a side entrance no one had ever seen used before. They disappeared inside, and the door closed with a sound of finality. By evening, the household staff had pieced together fragments of information. The new arrival was named Jordan Tinsdale. She had come from the Tinsdale estate near Lynchburg, sold at auction after old Charles Tinsdale died. The price had been unusually low, $340, because no one else wanted to bid on someone so peculiar. The auction master had listed her as female, age 19, unusual aspect, unsuitable for normal labor. What made Jordan unsuitable was apparent to anyone who saw her: the beard that grew despite her feminine features, her voice that fell somewhere between male and female registers, the way her body seemed to confound every expectation of what a woman should look like. Dr. Covington saw something else entirely. He saw the rarest of medical phenomena walking into his home, a living example of what physicians were only beginning to understand about human development, about the ways bodies could develop characteristics of both sexes, about the mysteries of generation and heredity. He saw an opportunity that might never come again. That first night, Jordan slept, if sleep was the right word, in a room in the eastern wing of the house. It wasn't the quarters where other enslaved people lived. It wasn't a bedroom in the family section. It was something in between, a space that had once been a storage room, now hastily furnished with a bed, a washstand, a chair. The door had a lock on the outside. Jordan sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the dress from the auction, and tried to understand what was happening. She had been owned by 3 different people in her 19 years. She had been stared at, examined, discussed like a curiosity or a problem to be solved. But she had never been brought into a master's house like this. Never been given a private room. Never been the focus of such intense interest from someone with the doctor's particular expression, not lustful, not even cruel, but fascinated, clinical. She thought perhaps that was worse. Downstairs, Dr. Covington sat in his study, writing in a leather-bound journal. His handwriting was small, precise, excited. Acquired today the subject I have long sought, a clear case of hermaphroditic development in the human species. External examination reveals predominantly female characteristics, including breast development and feminine facial structure, but with notable androgenic features, facial hair growth, deeper vocal register, and reports from the previous owner of unusual anatomy that requires private verification. The scientific possibilities are extraordinary. This may provide the key to understanding questions of heredity, of the transmission of characteristics, of the very mechanisms of human generation. I must proceed carefully, methodically. Everything must be documented. He wrote for another hour, planning examinations, measurements, observations. Only once did he pause, pen hovering over paper, as a flicker of something, doubt, conscience, crossed his face. Then he continued writing. In the eastern wing, Jordan lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house settling around her. Through the small window near the ceiling, she could see a rectangle of night sky. She tried to remember what freedom had felt like, but the memory was already distant, already fading like stars behind moving clouds. She didn't know yet that this room would be her entire world for the next 16 years. She didn't know about the examinations to come, about what the doctor would discover during those examinations, about the use he would find for her once he understood her unique biology. She only knew that something terrible was beginning, and there was no one to help her stop it. 3 weeks passed. Jordan saw no one except Dr. Covington, who brought her meals himself and conducted what he called preliminary examinations. He measured her height, her weight, the circumference of her skull. He asked detailed questions about her monthly cycles, her medical history, her family background. He sketched her features in his journal with unsettling accuracy. Through it all, he remained polite, clinical. He explained what he was doing in medical terminology that meant nothing to Jordan. He treated her not cruelly, but with the distant courtesy one might show a laboratory animal. On the 21st day, he conducted the examination that changed everything. Jordan stood in the examination room while Dr. Covington completed what he termed a comprehensive physical assessment. When he finished, he stepped back with an expression of pure scientific triumph. "Remarkable," he said, more to himself than to her. "Truly remarkable. External female characteristics, but with internal male structures, testicular tissue, a rare form of intersex development. And if my hypothesis is correct..." He trailed off, already lost in thought. Jordan didn't understand most of what he was saying. She only knew that something in his demeanor had shifted from curious to determined. That evening, Dr. Covington called his daughters into his study for what he termed an important family discussion. Sarah, Elizabeth, and Margaret sat in the leather chairs facing their father's desk, uncertain what this was about but trained from childhood to listen attentively when he spoke. "I have made a significant scientific discovery," he began. "An opportunity that may never present itself again. I need to explain something to you about human heredity, about reproduction, about the advancement of medical knowledge." He talked for over an hour. He used careful language, medical terms, appeals to their education and intelligence. He framed everything as research, as progress, as their participation in something historically important. He explained about Jordan's unique biology, about questions that could be answered, about knowledge that could be gained. Sarah, the eldest, was the first to understand what he was actually proposing. Her face went pale. "Father, you cannot be suggesting..." "I am suggesting nothing improper," he interrupted smoothly. "I am proposing a carefully controlled scientific study. You are educated women. You understand the importance of advancing human knowledge. What I'm asking requires sacrifice, yes, but sacrifice in service of something greater than ourselves." Elizabeth and Margaret sat frozen, not yet fully comprehending but sensing the shape of something terrible taking form. Dr. Covington continued, his voice calm and reasonable, "You are my daughters. I have raised you to value knowledge, to understand that progress sometimes requires courage. This research could change our understanding of human reproduction. It could establish our family's name in medical history. And it requires subjects who are intelligent, healthy, and willing to participate in carefully documented procedures." Willing. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "You have a choice," her father said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "You can agree to participate in this research, or you can choose to leave this house with nothing, no support, no prospects, no protection. You know what happens to unmarried women without family resources in Virginia. You know the alternatives." It wasn't a choice. It was coercion dressed in the language of options. Margaret, the youngest and most sheltered, began to cry. Elizabeth sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap. Sarah met her father's eyes with a look of betrayal so complete it would haunt her for the rest of her life. "When do these procedures begin?" Sarah asked, her voice hollow. "We will start slowly. Give you time to prepare mentally. I will arrange everything with proper medical precautions. You will not be harmed physically, I promise you that." He believed his own promise. In his mind, what he was proposing was a medical procedure, no different from any other treatment. He had convinced himself that science justified anything, that knowledge gained outweighed any temporary discomfort, that his daughter's participation was a gift to posterity. This was what made Dr. Edmund Covington truly dangerous, not malice, but absolute conviction in his own rightness. The daughters left the study in silence. They went to Sarah's room and sat together, not speaking, not crying, just existing in the shared horror of understanding that their lives had fundamentally changed and there was no escape. In the eastern wing, Jordan sat in her locked room, unaware that she had just become central to a plan that would destroy everyone it touched, herself, the daughters, the children who would be born, everyone except the men who had designed it all. The first procedure happened 3 weeks later in April 1847. Dr. Covington prepared the eastern wing room with medical instruments, cleaned linens, detailed notes. He explained to Sarah again, using careful clinical language, exactly what would happen. He treated it as a medical appointment, a treatment, a procedure. Sarah went to that room feeling like she was walking to her own execution. What happened behind that locked door cannot be detailed here. Not because it's too graphic for telling, but because some acts resist description, even by those who endured them. What can be said is this: when Sarah emerged 2 hours later, she was fundamentally changed. Something in her eyes had died. She walked back to her bedroom like a stranger in her own body. Jordan stayed in the eastern wing alone, with the weight of what had been done through her, with the knowledge that she had been used as an instrument of violation, with the horrific understanding that this was likely only the beginning. Dr. Covington retired to his study and wrote detailed notes about the procedure, timing, conditions, observations. He noted Sarah's distress but attributed it to natural nervousness about medical procedures. He was already planning the next session, calculating optimal timing based on his theories of conception. In the quarters, the enslaved people of Covington Manor sensed that something terrible had happened in the main house. They didn't know details, but they knew the quality of silence that follows trauma. They had heard that silence too many times before. Myra Dalton, carrying linens upstairs later that evening, caught a glimpse of Sarah through a partially open door. The young woman sat by her window, staring at nothing, her face reflecting the kind of devastation that comes not from a single moment of violence, but from the betrayal of trust by someone who should have protected her. Myra wanted to ask if she was all right. Wanted to offer comfort. Wanted to do something. But she knew the rules. Enslaved women didn't question what happened to white daughters in their fathers' houses. To ask would be to invite punishment. So she walked past carrying the clean linens, maintaining the silence that allows horrors to continue. The household settled into an uneasy rhythm. Days passed. Weeks. Dr. Covington continued his research, conducting additional sessions with Sarah according to his calculated schedule. He took meticulous notes. He treated everything as scientific inquiry, never acknowledging, perhaps never truly seeing, the human cost of his experiments. By July, Sarah showed signs of pregnancy. Dr. Covington's journal entry that day contained genuine excitement. The hypothesis appears confirmed. Successful conception has occurred. This proves that the subject possesses functional reproductive capability despite predominantly female external presentation. The implications for our understanding of human generation are profound. He noted Sarah's physical symptoms with the same clinical detachment. Morning sickness was recorded as expected maternal adaptation. Her depression was emotional volatility common in early gestation. Sarah herself barely spoke anymore. She moved through the house like a ghost, performing her duties mechanically, avoiding mirrors, avoiding her sister's eyes. Elizabeth and Margaret watched their sister's transformation with growing dread, knowing their turn was coming. In September, Dr. Covington began the same process with Elizabeth. The pattern repeated: the careful preparations, the clinical language, the locked room, the emerged daughter who was no longer quite herself. Elizabeth handled it differently than Sarah. Not with silent withdrawal, but with frantic compliance, as if perfect obedience might somehow make it hurt less. It didn't. By November, both daughters were visibly pregnant. Dr. Covington began crafting the fiction that would explain these pregnancies to the outside world. He invented the Hartwell family, 3 brothers, traveling merchants conveniently away on business. He created entire backstories for these fictional men, complete with correspondence he wrote himself and signed with invented signatures. The lie was elaborate and completely unnecessary. No one outside the household would question too closely. Virginia society in 1847 was full of strange family arrangements, of children raised by aunts, of absent fathers. Dr. Covington's reputation as a respectable physician provided cover for almost anything. But he created the fiction anyway, not for others, but for himself. He needed to maintain the illusion that what he was doing was socially acceptable, that his daughters were having normal reproductive experiences, that he wasn't systematically abusing everyone under his authority. Sarah delivered in March 1848. A daughter, healthy, normal, beautiful. Dr. Covington recorded the birth with clinical precision: weight, length, time of delivery, observable characteristics. He noted with interest that the child showed no unusual features, appears entirely typical in development. Sarah held her daughter and felt something break open inside her, a rush of love so fierce it was almost violent, mixed with shame so deep it threatened to drown her. This child was innocent. This child was hers. This child was also proof of what had been done to her. How does a mother reconcile loving someone whose very existence reminds her of trauma? Sarah named her daughter Ruth. She didn't explain why. She didn't explain anything. She just held Ruth and cried silently while her father took measurements and wrote notes. 3 months later, he began sessions with Margaret, the youngest daughter. Margaret was 17 years old. She had watched what happened to her sisters. She knew exactly what was coming. The night before her first scheduled procedure, she tried to run away. She made it as far as the edge of the property before Silas Fletcher found her. "Please," she begged him. "Please help me get away. Please." Silas looked at this white girl, this child really, and felt the familiar agony of powerlessness. He was enslaved. She was free. But somehow they were both trapped by the same man's will. "I can't," he said, and heard how hollow the words sounded. "If I help you run, he'll kill me. Might kill my family, too. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Margaret returned to the house. The next day, she went to the eastern wing. When she emerged, something in her had crystallized into rage so cold it would sustain her for the next decade. The household of Covington Manor settled into its new reality. 3 daughters pregnant in rotation. An enslaved woman kept locked in the eastern wing, used for purposes no one outside the family understood. A respected physician conducting what he genuinely believed was important research. And slowly, inevitably, children were born. The years accumulated like sediment. 1848 became 1849 became 1850. Children appeared with mechanical regularity. Sarah delivered twice more. Elizabeth added another child. Margaret had her first. 7 children total by 1856. All supposedly fathered by the invisible Hartwell brothers. The house filled with the sounds of childhood, crying babies, toddler laughter, children's questions. The daughters became mothers, teaching their children to read, to behave, to navigate a world that seemed normal but was built entirely on lies. Myra Dalton, still working in the household after nearly a decade, watched the children grow with complicated feelings. They were beautiful children, bright, healthy, curious. They called their mothers Mama but had been taught that their fathers were away on business. The oldest, Ruth, was now 8 and starting to ask uncomfortable questions. "When will Papa come home?" she asked Sarah one morning. Sarah's hands froze over the breakfast dishes. "Soon, darling. Papa will come home soon." But Papa would never come home because Papa didn't exist. Jordan remained in the eastern wing, her life reduced to a cycle of isolation punctuated by the doctor's visits. She was now 27 years old but looked older. The years of confinement had left her thin, hollow-eyed, moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had stopped expecting anything from life. The doctor still brought her meals personally, still conducted his examinations, still used her for his research whenever his calculations determined the timing was optimal. He treated her with the same clinical courtesy he always had, never cruel, never kind, just relentlessly methodical. Sometimes during the procedures with the daughters, Jordan tried to make eye contact with them, tried to communicate something, sympathy, or shared understanding, or apology. But the daughters kept their eyes closed or fixed on the ceiling. To acknowledge Jordan as a person, to see her humanity, would have made the whole situation impossible to endure. So everyone maintained the necessary fictions. Jordan was a specimen. The procedures were medical research. The children were gifts from traveling fathers. Everything was fine. Except nothing was fine. In 1851, Dr. Marcus Whitfield visited Covington Manor to consult on a medical case in the county. He was an old colleague of Edmund's from medical school, and he arrived expecting pleasant conversation and professional consultation. What he found instead troubled him deeply. "Your household is unusual, Edmund," Whitfield observed carefully over dinner. 3 daughters, 7 children between them. "Yet I see no husbands, no male relatives, just you and the children and your daughters." "The fathers are traveling," Edmund explained smoothly. The Hartwell brothers, merchants and military men, often away on business. All three brothers married your three daughters. That's quite a coincidence. Not a coincidence. A deliberate family connection. We value keeping relationships close. Whitfield didn't quite believe this, but what alternative explanation could there be? He let the matter drop. Later, searching for medical supplies, Whitfield tried a door in the eastern wing and found it locked. What's in there? Edmund's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Storage. Medical specimens. Not relevant to your visit. That night, alone in the guest room, Whitfield wrote in his journal, "Something is wrong at Covington Manor. I cannot articulate what exactly, but I have the distinct sensation of a household maintaining elaborate pretenses. Edmund has always been eccentric, but this feels like something more troubling. However, without evidence of actual wrongdoing, what can I say? That I have suspicions. That the atmosphere feels wrong. These are not grounds for action." He left the next morning, his suspicions unvoiced, his concerns dismissed as perhaps being uncharitable toward an old friend. The silence held. The children continued to grow. Ruth, now 10, had become especially close to her cousin James, Elizabeth's eldest son. They played together, studied together, occasionally whispered about how strange it was that they had never met their fathers. "Do you think they're real?" James asked one afternoon when they were alone in the library. "Mama says they're real," Ruth answered carefully. "That's not what I asked." Ruth looked at her cousin and saw her own doubts reflected there. "I don't know. Something feels wrong, but I don't know what." They dropped the subject, but the seed of questioning had been planted. In the quarters, the enslaved community had developed its own understanding of what was happening. They didn't know details, how could they, but they knew Jordan existed. Knew she was kept separate. Knew the daughters kept having children without any men around. "Doctor's doing something unholy," whispered one of the field hands during evening gatherings. "Using that woman somehow. Don't know how, don't know why, but it ain't natural." "Natural or not ain't our business," Silas said firmly. "We got enough to worry about keeping ourselves alive without wondering about white folks' secrets." But privately, alone in his cabin at night, Silas thought about Margaret begging him to help her run away all those years ago. He thought about the look in Jordan's eyes the few times he'd glimpsed her being moved between rooms. He thought about the daughters who no longer smiled, who moved through life like people serving sentences. He thought about how slavery wasn't just about field labor. It was about power. And power unchecked creates monsters. Dr. Covington, approaching his 60th year, showed no signs of slowing his research. His journals filled shelf after shelf, detailed observations of the children's development, notes on inherited characteristics, theories about the transmission of traits. He was convinced he was on the verge of significant scientific breakthroughs. In reality, he was simply documenting the consequences of prolonged abuse. By 1860, Sarah was 35, Elizabeth 33, Margaret 28. They had spent 13 years living in their father's constructed reality, raising children born from circumstances they never chose, maintaining fictions that grew more elaborate with each passing year. The oldest children were teenagers now, old enough to notice inconsistencies, to ask harder questions, to sense that something fundamental didn't make sense about their family. And the nation around them was fracturing. Political tensions between North and South intensified. Talk of war filled newspapers. Virginia debated secession. The world that had allowed Dr. Covington to operate with impunity for over a decade was beginning to crack. In the eastern wing, Jordan sat by her small window and watched the seasons change. Spring to summer to fall to winter, year after year. She was 33 years old now. Had spent half her life in this room. Had been used in ways she still didn't fully understand how to name. Sometimes she tried to remember what hope felt like. Sometimes she tried to imagine a future beyond these walls. Mostly she just existed, day to day, waiting for nothing in particular because wanting something would hurt too much if it never came. The household continued its routines. Meals were served. Children were taught. Dr. Covington wrote his notes. The daughters moved through practiced motions of maternal care while carrying unspoken trauma. And outside, in the spring of 1861, the nation went to war. The Civil War arrived in Virginia not with a single dramatic moment, but as a slowly tightening pressure. Fort Sumter fell in April 1861. Virginia seceded in May. By summer, Confederate recruiters were moving through Albemarle County, taking young men for military service. Dr. Covington was too old for conscription, and his position as a civilian physician made him valuable to the community. He continued his practice, treating injuries and illnesses, maintaining his reputation as a skilled if somewhat cold practitioner. The war barely touched Covington Manor's daily routines at first. The harvest continued. The children continued their lessons. The daughters continued their silent endurance. But war has a way of destabilizing careful constructions. In March 1862, Confederate authorities began more aggressive requisitioning of supplies. A quartermaster captain named James Rutledge arrived at the estate to inventory resources for military seizure. Dr. Covington received him cordially, showed him through the property, provided detailed lists of available grain and livestock. Everything proceeded routinely until Captain Rutledge became disoriented in the main house's hallways. Seeking what he thought was the rear exit, he opened a door in the eastern wing, the door that was supposed to be locked. Inside, Jordan sat on her bed, wearing the same simple dress she had worn for years. Her hair was pulled back. Her beard, now fuller after 15 years, covered the lower half of her face. She looked up at the sudden intrusion with eyes that had forgotten how to register surprise. Captain Rutledge stared. Jordan stared back. "Who are you?" Rutledge asked. Before Jordan could answer, Dr. Covington appeared behind the captain, his face tight with controlled anger. "This is a medical patient under my care. Private quarters. I must ask you to respect patient confidentiality, Captain." Rutledge backed out of the room, apologizing, but his mind was working. A bearded woman locked in a private room. A patient who needed to be kept separate. Something about the situation felt wrong, though he couldn't quite articulate what. He completed his inventory and left. That evening in his camp, he mentioned the incident to other officers. "Covington's got someone strange locked up in his house." A Negro woman with a full beard. Claimed it was medical care, but the way she looked at me, like she was begging for help. The story spread the way unusual stories do among soldiers, something to talk about between drills, an oddity to speculate on. "Sarah, he told us it was science. He made us believe we were contributing to human knowledge. But science is just a word. What he did was. I don't have words for what he did. And Jordan, she never had a choice. We barely had a choice. But she had less. She was property. We were daughters. He owned us all, just in different ways. Elizabeth, I tried to make it not real. Tried to think of it as medical treatment, as something that was happening to someone else. 16 years of trying not to be present in my own body. The children, I love them desperately, but they're also evidence of everything we endured. How do you explain that to them? How do you tell your child the truth about how they came to exist? Margaret, he destroyed us all. Jordan most of all. At least we have each other, have our children, have some purpose beyond just existing. Jordan has had nothing but that room and whatever he required from her. If you're going to arrest anyone, arrest him. If you're going to help anyone, help her." Major Barrett arrested Dr. Covington on the spot, though under what charge he wasn't entirely certain. Military law during wartime is chaotic. What crime had actually been committed? Abuse of enslaved people was legal under Virginia law when it began. The daughters couldn't claim rape legally, they had no right to refuse their father's directions. But everyone present knew something monstrous had happened here, even if the law had no adequate language for it. Dr. Covington, under military custody, showed no remorse. I conducted research that advanced human understanding. My methods were sound. My daughters participated with full knowledge of the scientific importance. The subject, Jordan, was well cared for throughout. Nothing I did violated medical ethics as they existed when I began this work. He genuinely believed this. That's what made him so disturbing, not doubt or guilt, but absolute conviction in his own righteousness. Major Barrett faced an impossible situation. The war was still raging. He had no clear legal authority over civilian matters. The case was so unusual that no precedent existed for how to handle it. He made a practical decision. Dr. Covington would remain under house arrest while Barrett submitted reports to his superior officers. The daughters and children would remain at the estate for now. Jordan and the other formerly enslaved people would be relocated to a contraband camp where freed people were gathering under federal protection. The day Jordan left Covington Manor, she walked out through the front door, something she had never done before. She carried nothing because she owned nothing. 16 years of her life compressed into the simple act of walking out of a house. Myra walked beside her, having chosen to leave with the other freed people. As they reached the road, Myra glanced back at the manor. "You ever want to see that place again?" she asked Jordan. Jordan didn't look back. "No. Never. I don't want to remember it. I want to forget every day I spent in that room. I want to forget what I was used for. I want to forget the daughters' faces. I want to forget the doctor's voice. I want to forget all of it." "Can you forget?" "No. But I can try." They walked toward the contraband camp, toward something resembling freedom, though neither of them quite knew what freedom meant after so many years of having none. Behind them, Covington Manor sat quiet in the spring sunlight, looking like any other Virginia estate, beautiful, peaceful, normal. Only the people who lived there knew what had happened in the eastern wing. Only they knew what kind of monsters can be created when authority goes unchecked, when science becomes an excuse, when human beings are reduced to instruments of someone else's curiosity. The contraband camp outside Charlottesville sprawled across what had once been a tobacco field. Hundreds of formerly enslaved people crowded into makeshift shelters, tents, lean-tos, converted barns. The Union Army provided minimal support, some rations, some medical care, but mostly just the promise that they wouldn't be returned to bondage. Jordan found herself in this chaos with no preparation for how to exist as a free person. She was 35 years old but had the life experience of someone who had spent 16 years in a single room. Everything overwhelmed her, the noise, the crowds, the choices she was suddenly expected to make about where to sleep, what to eat, where to go. Myra stayed close, guiding her through basic decisions. But even Myra couldn't help with the deeper problem. Jordan didn't know who she was beyond what she had been used for. Other freed people in the camp tried to be kind, but Jordan's appearance made social connection difficult. The beard, the ambiguous voice, the way her body didn't quite match any category people understood, it all marked her as different, and different meant isolated, even among people who were themselves outcasts. She found work doing laundry, simple physical labor that required no interaction. She moved through days mechanically, speaking to no one unless necessary, sleeping fitfully in a corner of a crowded tent, existing but not quite living. Private Burke, one of Major Barrett's soldiers, made several attempts to talk with her. He was genuinely concerned, genuinely trying to help, but his questions, "How do you feel? What do you want to do? What are your plans?" made no sense to Jordan. "I don't feel," she finally told him one afternoon. "I don't want. I don't plan. I just am. That's all I know how to do." "You're free now," Burke said, trying to sound encouraging. "You can make your own choices." Jordan looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "Free to do what?" "I've been locked in a room since I was 19. I don't know how to be free. I don't know what I'm supposed to want. And even if I did, this," she gestured at her face, her body, "makes me a curiosity anywhere I go. People stare. People whisper. People wonder what I am." At least in that room, only one person stared. The conversation haunted Burke. He wrote about it in letters home, trying to process what he had learned at Covington Manor, trying to understand what justice would even look like in this situation. Meanwhile, back at the estate, Dr. Covington remained under house arrest, confined to his property but otherwise comfortable. His daughters and grandchildren continued living there, maintaining routines out of sheer necessity. The children needed to eat, needed lessons, needed some semblance of normalcy. But normalcy was impossible now. The 7 children, ranging in age from 3 to 15, sensed that something fundamental had changed. Ruth, the eldest at 15, confronted her mother Sarah directly. "The soldiers were asking questions about my father," Ruth said. "About where he came from, about who our fathers really are." Sarah's hand stilled on the mending she was doing. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I'd never met my father, that he was traveling." "That's what you always told us." Ruth's voice was sharp with emerging anger. "But that's not true, is it? There is no traveling merchant named Samuel Hartwell. You made him up." Sarah set down her sewing and met her daughter's eyes. For 16 years, she had maintained lies. For 16 years, she had protected her children from the truth. But the structure was collapsing, and she couldn't hold it together anymore. "No. He's not real." "Then who is my father?" Sarah closed her eyes. "How do you explain the unexplainable? How do you tell your daughter she was conceived through coercion? That her grandfather had used an enslaved woman to impregnate his own daughters? That her very existence was evidence of crime so disturbing that Major Barrett had had no legal framework to prosecute them?" "Someone who had no choice," Sarah finally said. "Someone who was used, like we were used, by someone we should have been able to trust." "Grandfather." "Yes." Ruth sat with this for a long moment. She was 15 years old, intelligent, educated by her grandfather's own curriculum. She understood biology. She understood power. She understood what her mother was saying without saying it explicitly. "The woman with the beard," Ruth said quietly. "The one the soldiers freed. She's our father." "Biologically, yes. But father isn't the right word. She was a victim, Ruth. Just like your aunts and I were victims. Just like you and your cousins are victims of circumstances you never chose." Ruth began to cry. Not gentle tears, but wrenching sobs that came from suddenly understanding that her entire life had been built on foundations of horror. "What are we? What am I?" Sarah pulled her daughter close. "You are my child. You are loved. You are not responsible for how you came into this world. None of this is your fault." But Ruth couldn't hear comfort through the noise of her collapsing worldview. Everything she had thought she knew about herself, about her family, about her place in the world, all of it had been revealed as fiction built on suffering. The other children learned the truth in similar ways over the following weeks. Some from their mothers, some from overheard conversations, some from putting together fragments of information. Each responded differently: anger, confusion, denial, grief. But all were fundamentally changed by the knowledge. If this account is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support our work uncovering these forgotten truths, and subscribe to Liturgy of Fear so you never miss stories like this one. Let's discover together what happened next to this shattered family. In May 1863, military authorities finally reached a decision about Dr. Covington's case. The legal complications were insurmountable. The initial acts had occurred under laws that had since been voided by war. The victims included white women who couldn't testify against their father under Virginia law. And the whole situation was so unusual that no precedent existed for prosecution. They released him from house arrest with a stern warning and a notation in military records. No trial. No punishment. Just a mark in a file that would likely never be examined again. Dr. Covington returned to full control of his estate and his household. For the daughters, this was devastating. They had hoped desperately, impossibly, that the Union Army would provide some form of justice, some acknowledgement that what had happened to them was wrong. Instead, their father simply resumed his position as head of household, and they were expected to continue as before. Margaret couldn't accept this. The rage she had been compressing for 16 years finally broke through. 3 days after her father's release from restriction, she walked into his study, where he sat writing as if nothing had changed. "You destroyed us," she said, her voice shaking. "You destroyed Jordan. You destroyed your own daughters. You destroyed those children who now know they're the product of whatever you want to call what you did. And you face no consequences. None. Edmund looked up from his journal, his expression one of mild irritation at being interrupted. I conducted research. Important research. The military authorities understood that, even if they couldn't publicly acknowledge it. What I did was scientifically sound. Scientifically sound. Margaret repeated. You raped your own daughters through another person. That's what you did. Call it research if you want, but that's the truth. I never touched you inappropriately. No. You just arranged for someone else to do what you wanted done. That's not better. That's worse. Edmund set down his pen with precise care. You're overwrought. Understandable, given recent disruptions. But you need to remember that this family's survival depends on maintaining dignity and discretion. These outbursts help no one. Margaret stared at her father and realized with horrifying clarity that he genuinely could not see what he had done as wrong. He had convinced himself so thoroughly that his actions were justified that genuine remorse was impossible. He was beyond redemption because he saw no need for redemption. She left his study and went to her room. There she sat at her desk and began writing letters, to her sisters, to her children, to anyone who might one day want to understand what had happened at Covington Manor. She wrote for 3 hours, recording everything she could remember, every detail of 16 years of horror. She sealed the letters and hid them in different locations throughout the house. Then she went to the kitchen, told Myra, who had returned to work at the manor despite being freed, that she needed laudanum for a headache. The request wasn't unusual, laudanum was common for pain management. Myra brought her a small bottle. Margaret took it to her room. That night, she drank the entire bottle. Sarah found her sister's body the next morning. Margaret lay on her bed, looking almost peaceful, with a letter pinned to her nightdress addressed to Sarah. I cannot continue. I have tried for 16 years to survive what Father did to us. I have borne children from that survival. I have watched those children grow up confused and damaged by secrets we had to keep. And now, after everything, he faces no punishment. He will continue as he always has. I cannot watch that. I cannot be part of this household anymore. I am tired, Sarah. So deeply tired. Please tell my daughters I love them. Please tell them this is not their fault. Please tell them that sometimes survival requires leaving, and sometimes the only way to leave is this. The household erupted into chaos. Dr. Covington, upon learning of Margaret's death, showed clinical interest in the effects of laudanum overdose but little emotional response to losing his daughter. He noted the details in his medical journal. This callousness broke something in Sarah. She had endured everything, the procedures, the pregnancies, the lies, the years of silence. But watching her father treat Margaret's death as merely another medical observation destroyed her last fragment of restraint. She gathered her children and Elizabeth's children. She told them they were leaving immediately. She didn't ask her father's permission. She simply began packing. When Edmund discovered what she was doing, he tried to assert authority. You can't leave. This is your home. Where will you go? Anywhere, Sarah said, her voice cold and final. Anywhere that isn't here. Anywhere that isn't under your control. You have no money, no support. You'll be destitute. Then we'll be destitute. But we'll be free of you. Dr. Covington, for perhaps the first time in his life, seemed genuinely uncertain. His carefully constructed world was disintegrating. His research subjects were leaving. His control was evaporating. If you leave, he said finally, you leave with nothing. I'll disown all of you. You'll have no claim to the Covington name, no inheritance, nothing. Good, Sarah said. I never want to hear the name Covington again. They left that afternoon, Sarah, Elizabeth, and 7 traumatized children, taking only what they could carry in 2 small wagons. The household staff watched them go, saying nothing but understanding everything. Dr. Covington stood on his porch and watched his family disappear down the long drive. Then he returned to his study and continued writing in his journal, as if this were simply another data point in his ongoing research. In the contraband camp, Jordan heard about Margaret's death through Myra, who came to visit. The news affected her more deeply than she had expected. She had barely known Margaret, had seen her only during those awful sessions in the Eastern Wing. But Margaret had been 19 when it all started. Younger than Jordan had been. Margaret had spent her entire adult life trapped by her father's plans. And now she was dead. She couldn't survive what was done to her, Myra said quietly. Shame of it is, neither could you really. You're alive, but you're not living. None of y'all are truly alive after what that man did. Jordan didn't respond. What was there to say? That evening, she made a decision. She couldn't stay in this camp, in this county, anywhere near Covington Manor or the memories it held. She needed distance. She needed to disappear into somewhere no one knew her story. She approached the camp administrators and asked about the colonization efforts she had heard discussed, freed people being given opportunities to immigrate to Liberia, to build new lives in Africa, far from everything that had happened in America. The process took months to arrange, but in October 1863, Jordan boarded a ship in Hampton Roads bound for Monrovia. She took nothing with her but the clothes on her back and a heart so heavy with trauma that she could barely feel it beating. As the ship pulled away from the American coast, she stood at the rail and watched Virginia disappear into the distance. She didn't feel relief or hope. She felt nothing except the numbing certainty that nowhere would ever feel safe, that she would carry that locked room with her wherever she went, that freedom was just another word for existing without chains but with all the same scars. The last anyone in Virginia heard of Jordan Tinsdale was a brief mention in a letter from a missionary in Liberia in 1865. A carpenter named Tinsdale has established a small workshop here. Keeps to herself. Excellent craftsmanship, but declines all social invitations. Seems to prefer solitude. Whether this was the same Jordan from Covington Manor, no one could say with certainty. But if it was, then at least she had found work, found peace in creating things with her hands, found distance from a past that had tried to define her entire existence. The years rolled forward. The war ended in April 1865. The nation began the painful process of reconstruction. Virginia's old social order collapsed, and new structures slowly emerged from the rubble. Sarah and Elizabeth, living in Baltimore under assumed names, struggled to raise their children in anonymity. Money was perpetually scarce. They worked as seamstresses, laundresses, whatever paid. The 7 children grew up knowing they were hiding from something, but not always understanding what. Ruth, now 17, took a job as a teacher's assistant. She was intelligent, capable, determined to build something good from the broken pieces of her life. But the knowledge of her origins haunted her. She caught herself checking mirrors obsessively, looking for signs of Jordan in her own face, looking for the beard, the ambiguous features, anything that might mark her as different. She found nothing. She looked entirely ordinary. But the fear remained. Back in Virginia, Dr. Edmund Covington continued his practice. Patients still came to him, fewer than before, and whispers followed him everywhere. But he maintained his professional dignity. He was 60 years old now, still writing in his journals, still convinced that history would vindicate his research. In the summer of 1865, he received a letter from a former colleague, Dr. Prescott, asking about the unusual case that military reports had mentioned. The inquiry was carefully worded, academically curious, non-judgmental. Edmund responded enthusiastically. Finally, someone who might understand the scientific importance of what he had accomplished. He wrote detailed letters explaining his research, the subjects involved, the outcomes observed. He offered to share his journals, to collaborate on a paper that might be published in medical literature. Dr. Prescott's response was not what Edmund expected. I cannot in good conscience participate in documenting research conducted without the consent of all parties involved. What you describe, regardless of scientific merit, represents serious violations of human dignity. I must decline your offer and strongly recommend you cease any attempts to publish this work. Edmund, reading this letter in his study, felt genuine confusion. Violations of human dignity. But science must sometimes require difficult choices. Progress requires sacrifice. Why couldn't people understand that? He filed the letter away and continued writing in his journals, which now contained not just medical observations but long philosophical justifications for his work. He was writing for posterity, for future scientists who would understand what he had accomplished, who would see past the temporary moral qualms of his contemporaries. One evening in late summer, he sat in his study working on these entries when he heard someone enter the house. Footsteps in the hallway. The study door opened. Sarah stood there, 39 years old, thin from hard labor, her face etched with lines that shouldn't have been there for another decade. "Father," she said. "We need to talk." Edmund set down his pen. "You left. You disowned the family name. What brings you back?" "Margaret's grave. I came to visit Margaret's grave, and while I was here, I realized I needed to ask you one question." "What question?" Sarah stepped fully into the room, and Edmund noticed she was carrying something, a small pistol, common enough for travelers in these uncertain times. She set it on his desk, not threatening, just present. "Do you feel any guilt at all?" Sarah asked. "Any remorse? Any recognition that what you did was wrong?" Edmund considered this seriously. He had always prided himself on honest self-examination. "I conducted research that I believed, and still believe, was scientifically valuable. I ensured that no one was harmed physically. I provided for everyone's material needs. I documented everything carefully. Could I have proceeded differently? Perhaps. But given the circumstances and opportunities available, I acted in ways that advanced human knowledge. So no. I don't feel guilt in the way you're asking." Sarah nodded slowly, as if she had expected this answer but needed to hear it confirmed. "You destroyed multiple lives. Mine. Elizabeth's. Margaret's. Jordan's. 7 children's. And you feel no remorse because you call it science. Science requires difficult choices sometimes. It wasn't science. It was abuse dressed in scientific language. But you'll never see that, will you? You'll die convinced you were right." "I am right." Sarah picked up the pistol. Edmund tensed slightly but didn't move. His daughter stood there holding the weapon, looking at him with an expression that contained no anger now, just exhausted finality. "I came here thinking maybe I'd kill you," she said quietly. "Thought maybe that would feel like justice. But now I realize you're already dead in every way that matters. You killed everything human in yourself years ago, when you decided people were just specimens. Killing your body wouldn't accomplish anything." She set the pistol back down on his desk. "I'm taking some of your journals with me. The ones that document what you did. I'm going to hide them where someday maybe someone will find them and understand what kind of monster you were. Not for my sake, I'll be dead before anyone cares. But for Jordan's sake. For Margaret's sake. For the truth's sake." Edmund started to object, but Sarah was already gathering journals from his shelf, a dozen volumes, heavy with years of observations. She loaded them into a bag she had brought. "Goodbye, Father. I hope whatever hell exists has a special place for people like you." She left. Edmund sat in his study, surrounded by the remaining journals, and felt for perhaps the first time in his life a flicker of something that might have been doubt. But the flicker died quickly. He returned to writing, convinced that posterity would understand, that future scientists would see past these emotional objections, that his work would eventually be recognized for its importance. He was wrong. 3 months later, in November 1865, Dr. Edmund Covington died. The official cause was listed as heart failure. He was alone when it happened, slumped over his desk, pen still in hand, mid-sentence in a journal entry explaining why his research had been misunderstood. No one attended his funeral except the minister required to perform the service and 2 men hired to dig the grave. He was buried in the family cemetery on the estate, next to Margaret, beneath a simple marker with his name and dates. The estate was sold immediately afterward. The new owners, a family from Pennsylvania with no knowledge of what had happened there, found the house's eastern wing unsettling. The room where Jordan had been kept felt wrong somehow, cold even in summer, oppressive, heavy with something they couldn't name. They demolished that section of the house in 1867, reducing the eastern wing to rubble and building a new addition that had no connection to what had been there before. The journals Sarah had taken were hidden in various locations. Some she buried. Some she gave to trusted friends with instructions to keep them sealed for decades. She wanted the truth preserved but not immediately available. Wanted time to pass before her children's grandchildren might encounter this history. Decades passed. The 19th century became the 20th. The people directly involved died one by one, taking their immediate memories with them. Ruth Brennan, she had changed her surname when she married, lived until 1919. She became a respected teacher, raised 3 children of her own, never told them about her grandmother's ordeal or her biological grandfather's identity. She carried the secret until her deathbed, when she finally told her eldest daughter a simplified version: "Your great-grandmother suffered terribly. Your great-grandfather was a cruel man. That's all you need to know." Elizabeth survived until 1928, working as a seamstress in Washington until her fingers could no longer hold needles. She maintained correspondence with one of her sons, who became a printer in Chicago. In her final letters, she wrote, "I hope you build a better life than the one I had. I hope you never have to pretend to be someone you're not. I hope you can be simply and honestly yourself." The 7 children born at Covington Manor scattered across America, living under assumed names, building families, carrying trauma they couldn't fully explain even to those who loved them. Some thrived despite their origins. Others struggled with depression, with relationships, with the weight of secrets that couldn't be shared. By 1900, most people in Albemarle County had forgotten about the peculiar case at Covington Manor. Or rather, they remembered that something odd had happened there but couldn't recall details. The story became vague local legend: a doctor who had done something strange, daughters who had left under mysterious circumstances, an enslaved woman with an unusual appearance. But specifics faded like old photographs left in sunlight. In 1908, a historian named Dr. Martin Prescott, son of the physician who had refused to collaborate with Edmund Covington, discovered some of the sealed journals while researching antebellum medical practices. What he read disturbed him so profoundly that he debated for months whether to make the information public. He finally published a carefully worded paper in 1909 titled, "A Case Study in Medical Ethics, Coercion and Consent in Antebellum Research." He used initials instead of names, focused on ethical implications rather than sensational details, and treated all victims, Jordan, the daughters, the children, with respect. The paper caused limited discussion in medical ethics circles but didn't reach popular awareness. It was too academic, too careful, too uncomfortable for broad readership. The Covington Manor property changed hands multiple times. By 1920, the main house was divided into apartments. By 1940, much of it was demolished. The land was subdivided and sold. Houses were built where the fields used to be. A small shopping area occupied what had once been the entrance drive. The family cemetery remained overgrown and forgotten behind a new housing development. Dr. Edmund Covington's grave marker tilted at an angle, its inscription worn nearly smooth by weather and time. Margaret's grave beside it had no marker at all, her name erased as thoroughly as she had tried to erase herself in life. In Liberia, if the carpenter Tinsdale mentioned in missionary reports was indeed Jordan, she would have lived out her years in relative obscurity, building furniture, maintaining solitude, finding whatever peace was possible for someone carrying such trauma. Missionary records mentioned the carpenter's death around 1891, at approximately 63 years of age. The death certificate listed the name as simply J. Tinsdale, with no further details. Whether this was Jordan from Covington Manor remains uncertain, but if so, then she achieved what she had most wanted: distance from the past, anonymity, a life defined by her own choices rather than by someone else's use for her. The historical record grows sparse and fragmentary. The story of Covington Manor becomes one of thousands of troubling cases from American slavery and its immediate aftermath, known to specialists, unknown to the general public, too disturbing for comfortable discussion. But the effects ripple forward through generations. The descendants of those 7 children carry genetic inheritance from Jordan without knowing it. They carry psychological inheritance from trauma they never experienced directly but that shaped their parents' and grandparents' behaviors. They carry the weight of secrets that were kept to protect them but that also isolated them from their own history. By 1950, perhaps a dozen people alive still knew the full truth of what had happened at Covington Manor between 1847 and 1863. Most of them were elderly descendants of the original children, now confronting questions from their own grandchildren about family history that didn't quite make sense. Some chose to tell sanitized versions of the truth. Others maintained the silence their mothers and grandmothers had maintained. A few wrote it down, sealing the documents with instructions that they only be opened after certain dates, giving future generations the choice about whether to confront this history. The case shows us something uncomfortable about how easily human beings can rationalize harm when they convince themselves they're serving higher purposes. Dr. Covington genuinely believed he was advancing knowledge. He never saw himself as a monster. He saw himself as a dedicated scientist making difficult but necessary choices. This is perhaps more disturbing than simple cruelty would be, the recognition that ordinary people, intelligent people, educated people, can commit extraordinary harm while maintaining their own sense of righteousness. The story also shows us how systems of power, slavery, patriarchy, medical authority, can combine to create situations where multiple people are victimized simultaneously but in different ways. Jordan had no agency because she was enslaved property. The daughters had limited agency because they were unmarried women under their father's legal control. Even the children, born free and white, were victimized by circumstances they never chose and secrets that shaped their entire lives. No justice was ever served in any meaningful sense. Dr. Covington faced no criminal charges, no professional censure, no social ostracism. He died in his bed, surrounded by his journals, convinced he had contributed to human knowledge. Jordan found freedom but not peace, escaping physical captivity but never escaping the psychological impact of 16 years of use and isolation. The daughters found distance but not healing, living under assumed names, working hard jobs, raising children while carrying trauma they could never fully express. The children found normal lives but never quite felt normal, always sensing something wrong at their foundations, always carrying the weight of secrets that couldn't be named. This mystery shows us that some horrors don't involve ghosts or demons. They involve human beings making choices, rationalizing those choices through whatever language serves their purposes, and then living with, or running from, the consequences. What do you think of this story? Do you believe all the truth was ever revealed, or do you think even more remains hidden in archives and family secrets across America? Leave your comment below. If you found this historical investigation compelling and want more stories exploring America's darkest corners, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Hit the notification bell and share this video with someone who appreciates historical mysteries that challenge us to confront uncomfortable truths. See you in the next investigation.